Hello and welcome back. In this lecture we are going to talk about how to assess a study's construct validity. So remember that the construct of a study is the way that the researcher has decided to measure or manipulate some variable. And so in this lecture we are going to look at a few ways to critique the construct validity of a study, and the two major methods that we're going to look at are assessing the reliability of the measurement or manipulation, and then also critiquing the validity of the measurement or manipulation. So some things that you should know after this lecture would be how to assess the quality of construct validity, and then also being able to create your own operationalization of a construct. We'll get to that in a second. And then there are basically you'll then be asked to discriminate between different types of validity and reliability. Alright, so for a specific operational, or for a specific construct, say for example well-being here, there are multiple different ways that we could operationalize this construct. So if we are trying to measure the well-being of a person, we could give them a 5-item scale, a questionnaire of 5 questions asking them about whether they're depressed or happy and anything in between. So we can ask them a question. That would be self-report. That's one type of operationalization. A second type would be that we observe the individual. And so if we wanted to assess the well-being of a person for our study, instead of asking them questions, because people can lie, we might just observe their behavior, and we could count the number of smiles in an hour, say, and we would then say the more smiles in an hour, the happier the person is, or the higher their well-being. And we could also choose some other method, because people may fake smiling because they want other people to think that they're happy, and so maybe a better method of getting at their true well-being would be to take some physiological measurement. So we could bring people in, measure their cortisol. Higher cortisol is related to higher stress, and so we would say that people have more well-being or higher on our well-being scale if they have less cortisol. So remember that the construct is the idea, the abstract concept that we are trying to measure. And since we can't measure, how happy somebody is, or how stressed they are, or whether they're paying attention, or how much in love they are with somebody, these are abstract things. We have to measure something else, and that's the operationalization. So we choose some operation to measure that is representing some construct. So here are some for you to do on your own. So, healthiness. What would be a way to assess how healthy somebody is using self-report, and then using an observational method, and then using a physiological method? And I give some examples here, but you should try to come up with some on your own as well. So if our operationalization is healthiness, how is it that we could measure how healthy somebody is? And I want you to come up with a self-report, observational, and physiological example of your own. And I give you some here. Now this next one, calmness. So how could we measure whether an individual is very calm to whether an individual is not very calm? And I'll give you some time with that. So pause this, think of some examples. So here, in self-report, we could, ask people specific questions and then how they answer would give us some measure of how calm they are. So for example, in emergencies, do you tend to freak out, or are you a person that tends to remain pretty calm? We could look at an observational method, such as their voice volume. If they have a lot, if the volume of their voice is high, that would represent maybe not being so calm, or maybe the speed at which they're talking. Usually people that are calm talk more slowly. We could measure the number of fidgets that they have in a certain period of time. The more fidgets that they have, the less calm they are, the more stressed, more nervous. We could take a physiological measure such as blood pressure or heartbeat. If they are, if their blood pressure is higher, or they have more higher heartbeat, then that would represent less calm. Here's another one. So open-mindedness is the construct. How would we measure this? So take some time here, pause the video. And some examples. Self-report, we could ask them about whether they enjoy new experiences, or give them some controversial topic and see how they can respond to it. We could observe them, the number of times they say yes or I understand in some sort of argument. Do they tend to be agreeable? In physiological measure, we could measure their brain when we give them questions, and certain parts of the brain relate to being more open-minded than less open-minded. So the general idea here is that there are, when we are trying to measure something, some construct, there are multiple ways that we could go about measuring it. There are multiple operationalizations that would all be some way of measuring the construct, but not all of them are as good as others. So some operationalizations are better than others. So when you are reading a study or designing your own, you want to make sure that you are choosing a measure or choosing a manipulation that is the best type of manipulation or measurement for the specific question that you're asking. And this chapter will give you information on what do I need to know to create the right operationalization. So in your textbook, we're looking at reliability and validity. They give you this diagram here. So what you can see is here's construct validity, and what we are going to look at now is the reliability of measure of our construct. So what does that mean? So reliability of measurement. So we are measuring something. So we're measuring, say, whether a person is in love or not. We're measuring whether they like their job or not. And the question that we would be asking if we are critiquing the reliability of how the researchers measure, say, love, is where we're looking at, are the scores that the researchers get consistent? And can we trust the measurement that they're using? And so when we are critiquing the reliability of measurement, there are three types of reliability that we want to focus on. One is test-retest reliability, the other is inter-rater reliability, and the third is internal reliability. So again, remember that what reliability is asking is the answer to the question, are the researchers getting consistent responses? So whatever it is that they're measuring, are they measuring it consistently? That's reliability. So reliability is important because when we produce a measurement, say measuring attention or personality or stress, we want to be confident that the measurement is accurate. It should produce consistent results. If the tests or the observations that we get are wildly different, then we can't be confident that the measurement is precise. If I give a measurement of how psychologically stable you are, and it gives radically different responses each time I give it to you, then that's not a good measure. I can't be confident in the results. So it's important because we want to make sure that the results that we get the first time should be similar to the results that we get every other time. That's reliability. When you go and travel to a different town or a different country, and you find a Starbucks there. Let's say you travel to Thailand and you find a Starbucks. Well, you might get excited if you like Starbucks because you know that every Starbucks that you go to is going to give you the same result. It's reliable. And that's important. Every time you take an aspirin, you want the same result. Every time that you take your medication for some illness or depression or bipolar disorder, you want to know that that medicine is going to work the same way. So as psychologists, or if you're studying in the business sector, you want to know that the results that you get the first time are going to be similar to the results that you get every time you give the test. So the first type of reliability is test-retest reliability. So this may seem obvious. Basically, when you give the test once, you'll get some value. So from 1 to 10 on a happiness scale, somebody gets a 7. Well, then if you wait a little while and give the test again, if you have good reliability, then that test should give close to the number 7 again for that person. And we can test this reliability by giving the test multiple times to the same people and then seeing whether those scores correlate. So here we have some output from a meta-analysis of this internal consistency and reliability of satisfaction of life scale, and we can see that the correlations are quite good. One, they're positive, so that means that if a person scored highly the first time, 7 through 10, then they also scored highly the second time, around 7 through 10. And people who scored low the first time tended to score low the second time. So we have good test-retest reliability. We can be confident that if we give the test to a person once, we're probably going to get similar results when we give them the test a second time, or a third, or a fourth. We also may be interested in how individual observers are rating the construct for our study. So in observational studies, we'll have multiple researchers that are observing the behavior of people, and they're rating their behavior on some operationalization. So let's say we are measuring the happiness or well-being or sociability of kindergartners, and we don't want just one rater because people can be kind of biased. So maybe Matt, who is a rater of happiness of children, well, he has a child of his own, and so when he observes the behavior of these kindergartners, he tends to interpret their behavior in a positive way because it reminds him of his daughter, and his daughter and he are very close. And so when he's looking at behavior, he tends to say, "Oh, isn't that cute?" and starts to and biases his observations in that way. So one way to control for that is we have another person who is also observing the exact same behavior at the exact same time, and then we can compare the results. So if Matt and another rater, we'll say Mark, if they are agreeing most of the time whether somebody is happy or not, then we would have good inter-rater reliability. Inter-rater meaning within the raters. So if we have two raters, if they look at Jackie's behavior here, and both Mark and Matt give her somewhat low scores on happiness, then we would say that they agree. They're probably observing that Jackie is actually not very happy. And when they're observing another child, this child J, both Mark and Matt are giving this child high scores on happiness. So since both of them are giving them scores that are somewhat the same, we can be confident that they are representing the true happiness of J. So this example would be good inter-rater reliability, because both the Matt and Mark's ratings line up pretty well. When Mark rates somebody as happy, Matt also rates them as happy, and when Mark rates people as not happy, Matt rates people as not happy as well. So this would be good inter-rater reliability. Here would be an example of less good inter-rater reliability. So here, Mark is rating this kid J as very happy, whereas this is Peter now. Mark is rating J as happy. Peter is rating J as less happy. In fact, we have an even worse discrepancy here. Mark says that Jackie isn't happy at all, and Peter says that Jackie's very happy. So the problem here is that people can interpret the same behavior in slightly different ways. So here, Mark might be viewing Jackie's behavior as, shy and possibly withdrawn, whereas Peter is viewing the same behavior and interpreting it as calm and content. So what we're assessing here is the reliability of who is making the ratings. And what we want is high inter-rater reliability, meaning that it's probably the case that the behavior that the two raters are viewing is consistent, is the true behavior. And if we get something like this, low inter-rater reliability, then we're not sure who's right, and we probably have to redesign the study a little bit. So internal reliability, I'm really going to de-emphasize here. We're not going to use it in your projects. But basically the issue with internal reliability is that you're in a survey, you're going to ask multiple different questions. All of those questions are trying to get some information about the construct that you're interested in. So if you're interested in whether people are pro or against, for or against, say, gun control. Well, gun control is a complex issue, and it's not usually the case that someone will just say yes or no. When you ask somebody the question, they usually say yes, but, or no, but. So they have other factors which influence their response. So with internal reliability, if you have multiple questions which are trying to assess the construct, if you have high internal reliability, that means that the way that you're asking the questions has no impact on how people are responding. What that means is that if I say something like, when you wake up in the morning, if my construct is depression, I'm trying to measure whether people are depressed or not, and my operationalization is I'm going to create a survey with a bunch of different questions. Now, if I ask the question, when you wake up in the morning, does it take energy to get up? And you say, 1 through 5, 5 being, very much so, 1 being not very much. So if an individual is depressed, they might say 5. It takes energy to get up. If I ask another question like, when you wake up in the morning, or throughout the day, do you often have thoughts of just giving up? 1 through 5. 5 being very much so, 1 being not at all. And the person says 5. So the idea is that regardless of what the questions are that you ask, if you have good internal reliability, then all of those questions are relating to the idea of depression. If instead I say something like, when you're going throughout your day, do you tend to daydream? 1 through 5. Well, that daydreaming doesn't really have a whole lot to do with depression. And so that would lower your internal reliability, because people may respond randomly to that question based on how they would respond to the rest of the questions that deal with depression. So internal reliability deals with whether you get consistent scores because you're asking good questions that are actually related to your construct. versus whether you're asking questions that aren't related to your construct. So here, this is measured by the coefficient alpha. If you're asking a lot of questions that are dealing with your construct, then people should respond consistently, and then that should give you high internal reliability. So here's another example. So when we look at these questions here, 1 through 5 down there, should people respond the same to these questions? Do all of these questions have to deal with the same construct? And so obviously if we look at these, just take a look at these items here, we would see that questions 1, 2, and 5 are related to one another. They're looking at well-being. But 3 and 4 are completely unrelated. So what would happen here is that questions 1, 2, and 5 would have high internal reliability, and questions 3 and 4 would have basically no reliability with the other questions. So again, when we're creating a survey, we want to be very sure that the questions we're asking are related to or getting information about the construct that we're interested in. Alright, so we've discussed the 3 measures of reliability: inter-rater reliability, test-retest reliability, and internal reliability. These are ways to assess the consistency of measurement. And now we're going to move to validity of measurement. And so validity is questioning whether the study is whether the operationalization is actually measuring the construct that it's supposed to. So if we are, trying to measure happiness, and the way that we're measuring happiness is assessing whether people go to the gym or not, that's probably a low validity of measurement, because going to the gym doesn't really measure whether a person is happy or not. So in your textbook here we have construct validity. We can assess whether it's a good construct if we have reliability of measurement, and we can assess whether it's a good construct by whether it's a valid measurement as well. So when we're assessing the validity of measurement, we want to know whether the operationalization actually measures the construct. And there are 5 different ways that we are going to assess this. And actually for this class, we're not going to discuss convergent or discriminant. We're going to talk about face validity, content validity, and criterion validity. So face validity is pretty simple. Basically it's related to the idea of face value. So when we look at the measurement that a study is using to operationalize a construct, does it look like a good measure? And this is often done by asking experts. So if you develop some questionnaire which is looking at, say, internet addiction, and you want to ask somebody whether the questions you're asking are actually measuring whether somebody is addicted to the internet or not. You could go to some professor who is an expert in that area, give him your questions, and just say, do these look like good measures of internet addiction? And the second validity would be content validity, and that would be, are you including all components of the construct in the questions you're using? So for example, with internet addiction, maybe you're asking some questions about the behavior, but you're missing questions about the psychological component. Or for example, if your construct is health and all you ask about is physical health, and you don't ask any questions about the psychological health of the individual, then you may have low content validity. You're not including all of the elements that are important. So here's a scale which is looking at narcissism. which is done by a few researchers, Ames, Rose, and Cameron. And if we're just looking at these questions here, you're supposed to choose one of the two options. You can look, does this have good face validity, and does it have good content validity? And that means, are the questions actually measuring narcissism, or maybe they're measuring something else? And are they missing components? So when we look at something like here, I am going to be a great person, or I hope I am going to be successful. Now, which one would you choose? Now, if you chose I am going to be a great person, according to this scale, which is an actual scale, it's been published and verified, that would count towards being narcissistic. Now the question is, is that correct? Is that a valid measure? Is an option of I'm going to be a great person actually measuring that you are narcissistic? And we're just taking this at face value here because you're just kind of looking at it. And also when we're looking at these, we want to see, does this look at all aspects of narcissism? And this is only a few items, so we can't really assess that. So criterion validity. So here, what we're looking at with criterion validity is the measure that is used in the study, is that associated with some other behavior that it should be associated with. Okay, so that may be kind of confusing, but the idea is that whatever it is that we're measuring, that should relate to some observable behavior in that individual. And there are two methods to look at this. So, for example, if I have a questionnaire which is assessing whether somebody is happy or not, then when I go and give the test to somebody, and let's say that person scores very high on being happy, then if my test is actually measuring what it's supposed to be measuring, happiness, then when I go and observe that individual, I should notice that that person is extremely happy. They smile a lot, they laugh a lot, they have a lot of friends. Now, if I give my test and the person says, or the person scores very highly on my test, and then I go and observe the individual, and they're frowning, they sigh a lot, their movement is very slow, they don't laugh very often, they don't have many friends, then there's probably something wrong with my survey, because my survey says they're happy, but when I go and observe their behavior, it doesn't look like they're happy. So criterion validity is looking at, is there actual evidence that shows that my test is testing what it's supposed to be testing? So there are two methods for this. There's the correlational method and the known groups method. The correlational method is whether my measure correlates with key outcomes or behaviors. Basically what I've just given you an example of. And the known groups method is that, regardless of how somebody scores on my test, I could see whether I'm right or not by looking at groups of people that I know should score a certain way and seeing whether my test accurately discriminates between those two people. So let's give an example here. Okay, so for the correlational method of criterion validity, if I give somebody a test to see whether they are going to be a good salesperson, so maybe in business you want to, put people in the right departments based on their skill set, what they would be good at. So you give all the interns, all the people that you're going to hire a test to see whether they'll be good salespeople or not. And then you go, the people who score highly on this test, you go make them salespersons. Well, then you want to see whether your test is actually accurate. So if your person, here's the sales ability test score, scores highly here, then if our test is correct and it's actually measuring whether people will be good salespeople, then we should also see that later they are selling more stuff. So they score higher. And also, people who scored poorly on our sales ability test should be selling less stuff. And if that's the case, this correlational method, we should see that's highly correlated. People who scored highly on our test also sell more stuff. People who scored low on our test sell less stuff. So now we can be confident that our test is validly measuring whether somebody is a good salesperson. On the other hand, if we're measuring something like whether intelligence has anything to do with whether you're good at sales or not, and there might be some relationship. If you're smart, you tend to be good at other things, but it's probably not going to be as good as a specific test of sales. So here, if somebody scores high on the IQ, some of these people don't sell as much as people who scored lower on the IQ test. And so we see a larger spread of our data here. It doesn't fit that line as closely as these do here. And so measuring IQ would be a less valid measure of whether somebody is a good salesperson or not. And we would have evidence because of the correlational method. Now, the knowing groups method here is a little bit different. So if we know that people belong to a certain group, such as whether they are depressed or not, then if I give them my measurement of depression, then if those people belong to the group of not depressed, then when I give them my test, they should score and fit into the not depressed group. But if I give them my test and they score highly, like they're in the depressed group, then I can go check, are those individuals actually depressed? So the known groups is that we know where people belong, and then when I give them my test should tell me that they are in the group that we know they belong in. Here's another example. So if I'm measuring creativity and I give people a test of creativity and I find that 15 people score very highly on my creativity scale measure, then when I go look at what their professions are, I should find that they are in creative type professions like artists or musicians, for example. And the people who scored low on my creativity scale should be in professions that don't involve a lot of creativity. That would be good criterion validity using the known groups method. Alternatively, if I'm measuring creativity and I find, these 15 people are high on creativity, but then when I look at their actual jobs, and their jobs don't involve a whole lot of creativity, accountants, for example, or other non-creative professions, then I can't be confident that my scale is actually measuring creativity. I don't have criterion validity here. Alright, so we've talked about reliability and validity and these different the different types of those. And so one question is, can a measure be reliable but not valid? So for example, shoe size. We could use shoe size as a measure of intelligence. Now, this would be reliable because an individual's shoe size is going to be the same. It's not going to change very often, but it's not going to be valid because measuring shoe size does not actually have anything to do with our construct of intelligence. The same idea here would be with a broken clock. So a broken clock is going to be consistent. It's going to give the same time at this. A broken clock that is, say, 5 minutes fast, for example, is always going to be 5 minutes fast. But it's not valid. So it's reliable. It's always 5 minutes fast. You can count on it being 5 minutes fast. But it's not a valid measure of the time because it's not giving you an accurate measure of the time. So we can have we can have reliability without validity. So here's some examples. So here is something that is reliable but not valid, where all the measurements are about the same. So it's measuring whatever it is that it's measuring the same. It's reliable. But it's missing the target. It's not actually valid. It's not measuring what it's supposed to. Here we have the, it's not reliable or valid. We're not measuring anything well. We don't know what we're measuring, and we're not measuring it consistently. When we get reliability and validity, that's the sweet spot. That's what we want as a researcher. So when we give the test, we get similar results every time, regardless of when we give the test, regardless of who is taking the measurements, and regardless of how we're asking the questions. And it's valid because we have all of the contents that we're trying to measure. And when we look for evidence out in the world, we find that our tests give results that are consistent with the behavior of the individuals outside of the testing room. So reliability is necessary, but not sufficient for validity. So we can't have validity without also having reliability of measurement. But we can be reliable in our measurements and also not have valid measurements. So first we must assess reliability. Are we measuring things consistently? And then we can measure validity. Are we actually measuring what we're supposed to? Alright, so some examples of the literature. So if you are reading a study in a research project or somebody's analysis of something in business, you are going to get stuff written up in a very specific way. So there will be measures of test, retest reliability. So here we have a study which is looking at religiosity. So this is a researcher who has developed a set of questions. Here are the questions on the left. And these questions are designed to assess how religious somebody is. And so this researcher wants to make sure that they are measuring religiosity consistently. So they want to have reliability. And so they include a measure here, the test, retest reliability. So they give the test to people once, and then later they give the test to people again, and if they have good reliability, if they're consistent, that number will be high. And what they get here is an R value of 0.84. So that's a correlational value of 0.84. Remember, the highest we can get is 1. So that's a very high positive correlation, meaning that people who scored highly in religiosity the first time they took the test also tended to score highly the second time. And people who scored low the first time also tended to score low the second time. We know that this result is probably not due to chance. It's probably not just random that we found this consistency, because when we run the statistics, we find a p-value that's less than 0.001. What that means is that the possibility of us obtaining this strong of a correlation, 0.84, is less than 1 in 1,000. So very, very low. And so we're confident that this scale is reliable. It measures what it measures consistently. Now, we also want to get a measure of validity. Is it actually measuring religiosity, or maybe something else? And so they are going to use criterion validity here. And so what we find is that the individuals who are not affiliated with any sort of religion score a 22 on this scale. But if you are affiliated with a religion, a Protestant scored 38, Roman Catholic scored 30, and other religions scored 27.6, all of the people who identify as religious also score higher on this religiosity scale. So this would be criterion validity for the known groups. These people identify with a religious group, and they also score higher on our religiosity scale compared to people who don't identify as religious. We also find a criterion validity using the correlational method. When we look over here, if people score highly on our religiosity scale, we should find that their behavior reflects that finding. So people who score highly should probably do more religious things, like, say, attend church. And what we find is that if people score highly on our religiosity scale, they also tend to attend church more regularly than people who score low on this scale. So here we have both good reliability and good validity for our measurement here, which means that for this study, this method of assessing whether people are religious or not has good construct validity.